A black belt asked a black janitor to spar with him for fun. What happened next? Silence fell over the entire martial arts gym. Hey, you there, janitor? How about a quick demonstration? Derek Mitchell called from the center of the tatami mats, his black belt glinting in the fluorescent lights of the gym. Bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, have you? James Washington stopped mopping the floor and slowly looked up. At 42, he'd only been janitoring the gym for 3 weeks, always arriving after closing time when the students were leaving. But that Thursday night, the advanced class was running longer than usual. I don't want to disturb you, Sensei, James replied calmly, going back to scrubbing at a stubborn stain on the floor. Just finishing up here so you can get back to your business. Derek let out a loud, theatrical laugh that echoed around the room. Look at this, everyone. The kid's afraid to even set foot on the mat. The 8 students present laughed nervously, some clearly uncomfortable with the situation. What Derek didn't know was that James had spent the last 20 years trying to completely forget who he really was. 20 years had passed since he retired from the ring after an accident that changed his life forever. For 20 years, he'd kept a secret that not even his teenage daughter knew about. Come on, dude, Derek continued, approaching him with that smug grin he used to intimidate newbies. Just a little demonstration. Bet you don't even know how to get into a basic stance. How about you show my students the difference between someone who's training and someone who's just cleaning? James felt a familiar sensation in his chest, like a dormant muscle awakening after years of disuse. His eyes met Derek's for a moment, and for a split second something passed between them that made the instructor take an involuntary step back. Just a training demonstration, Derek insisted, now trying to hide the sudden uncertainty in his voice. Nothing serious, just to show the newbies why it's important to respect martial arts. James set the bucket down and stood up slowly. His movements were fluid, odd for a man who was supposed to have never set foot on the mat. Around the room, the students stopped training, realizing that something unusual was happening. Okay, James finally said, his voice as calm as the surface of a lake before a storm. But when we're done, you're going to apologize to all of them for turning the mat into a circus. Derek laughed, but this time the sound was a little strained. Apologize, man. You're going to be the one apologizing to the floor when you meet it. No one in the room knew that James Washington had once been James Silent Storm Washington, a 5-time mixed martial arts world champion. He'd retired at the peak of his career after an accident that claimed the life of his best friend and training partner. He'd since vowed never to fight again, but some promises have to be broken when dignity is at stake. If you enjoyed this story of overcoming adversity and fairness, be sure to subscribe to see how a simple moment of bias turns into the most humiliating lesson of Derek Mitchell's life. Derek adjusted his black belt with a dramatic gesture, clearly enjoying every second of the attention. Everyone, gather around. You're about to see a practical demonstration of why there is a hierarchy in the martial arts world. James watched as the 8 students formed a semicircle around the mat, some looking impatient for the demonstration, others looking uncomfortable. A young Asian woman with her hair pulled back muttered something to her neighbor, who shook his head disapprovingly. Look, everyone, Derek continued, gesturing dramatically. There you have it, a perfect example of someone who never understood that there are special places for certain people. Elite gyms aren't for, you know? James felt a familiar stab in his chest, the same one he'd felt 20 years ago whenever he'd heard similar comments about fighters who didn't look like champions. The difference was that now, at 42, he'd learned to turn his anger into fuel for something far more powerful than punches. Sensei Derek, the young Asian woman interrupted timidly. Shall we continue with our regular training? It's late. And Sarah Chun, are you questioning my training methods? Derek cut in sharply. Sit down and watch. You'll learn more in the next 5 minutes than you would in a month of regular training. James noticed how Derek had used the girl's full name, a clear show of authority. He also recognized the fear in her eyes, the same look he'd seen in the mirror 2 decades earlier when he'd woken up in a panic, remembering the accident that had taken the life of Tony the Hammer Rodriguez. Tony was dead because of him. It was simple. A series of punches James had thrown with excessive force during a sparring match. Tony had fallen, hit his head strangely on the floor, and never woken up. The investigation had concluded it was an accident, but James knew the truth. He had lost control under the pressure and the racist comments from the crowd that night. "So, janitor," Derek chuckled, "how about you show my students how to get into a basic stance? Or is that too advanced for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" Laughter echoed around the room, but James remained motionless. He closed his eyes for a moment, and this time he was back in that ring in Las Vegas, hearing the same comments that had preceded the tragedy that had changed his life forever. "What is it? Afraid?" Derek insisted, now circling James like a predator. "Or are you just going to stand there like a post, like you do with the squeegee all day?" And that's when Derek made his first fatal mistake. He nudged James's shoulder, a seemingly innocuous touch, but it carried all the brashness of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. James took the shove without moving an inch. His feet remained planted like the roots of an oak tree, and Derek felt like he was pushing against a concrete wall. The instructor's smug smile faltered for a split second. "Interesting," James muttered, more to himself than to Derek. "It's been a while since anyone's tried to provoke me like that." There was something in James's voice that changed the atmosphere. It wasn't a threat or anger. It was the chilling calm of a man who had been through much darker valleys and emerged transformed. Derek, unable to interpret the danger signals, doubled down. "You heard that, boys?" He was curious. "How about I show him the difference between someone who thinks and someone who knows?" What Derek didn't realize was that every humiliating word and gesture was awakening something in James that had been dormant for 2 decades. Not anger or revenge, but something far more dangerous. A crystal-clear memory of who he really was when he stopped hiding. Sarah Chun watched with growing concern. The way the janitor breathed, the way his muscles tensed almost imperceptibly, reminded her of the large Predator documentaries she'd watched on the Discovery Channel. The calm before the attack. "Last chance, friend," Derek announced, now clearly annoyed by James's lack of response. "Either you take the demonstration like a man, or I'm calling security to escort you out. And guess what? You'll lose your job too." James slowly opened his eyes. When his gaze met Derek's, the instructor felt a chill run down his spine, as if he'd just awakened a dragon he'd thought was a harmless lizard. "Okay," James finally said, his voice low but filled with an authority that instantly silenced everyone present. "But when we're done, I want you to explain to your students why you've turned a place of learning into a circus of humiliation." Derek laughed, but this time the sound was nervous. "Explain, man. You'll have a lot of explaining to do when you're on the floor." Neither of them knew that James had spent the last 20 years not only running from his past, but also cultivating an emotional control that had transformed his old destructive rage into something far more subtle and deadly effective. Each new humiliation only fueled the silent strength within him, the cold determination that his former adversaries knew, but that Derek was about to discover in the worst possible way. Derek straightened his posture, clearly pleased with the respectful silence that had fallen over the room. His 8 students had formed a perfect circle around the mat. Some were eager for a demonstration. Others were clearly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before them. "Everyone, you are about to witness a lesson worth more than 6 months of training," Derek announced theatrically, spreading his arms like a showman. "The difference between those who dedicate their lives to martial arts and those who just, well, clean the floor where real fighters walk." James stood motionless in the center of the mat. But something changed in his breathing. He closed his eyes for a moment, and this time he was no longer in that gym in Denver. He was back at the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas 22 years ago, hearing identical comments from the audience before his world title fight against Victor the Destroyer Petrov. "Look at that little black guy," someone shouted from the stands that distant night. "I bet he wouldn't last 3 rounds against a real fighter." James won by TKO in the second round, but the victory had cost him dearly. The onslaught of racist comments caused him to lose control during the next sparring session, resulting in the accidental death of Tony Rodriguez. "So, janitor," Derek said mockingly, now circling James like a predator, "how about you show my students how not to do basic defense, or is it too advanced for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" That's when Sarah Chin couldn't keep quiet any longer. The 22-year-old purple belt in jiu-jitsu and master's student in sports psychology had spent the last 2 years documenting discrimination in sports for her dissertation. What she had observed was valuable academic material, but also deeply disturbing. "Sensei Derek," she interrupted firmly, "can I ask you a question? Why exactly do you feel the need to humiliate a man who is simply doing his job?" The silence that followed was deafening. Derek turned slowly to Sarah. His eyes narrowed in a mixture of surprise and irritation. "Excuse me, Sarah, but who is teaching this class?" "You are," she replied calmly, "but it should not involve racial humiliation disguised as a technical demonstration." Several of the students exchanged nervous glances. None of them had ever had an argument with Derek before. The instructor felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Race?" Derek laughed. "It has nothing to do with race. It has to do with respect for the martial arts and knowing your place." James slowly opened his eyes. There was something in the way Sarah spoke, the courage of a young woman standing up to established authority, that reminded him of his younger sister, Kesha. She had the same determination, the same refusal to accept injustice in silence. Kesha had died at 17, the victim of a stray bullet during a police raid in her neighborhood. James had been performing in Japan when he got the news. Another loved one lost while chasing glory in distant rings. Another reason to give it all up and disappear into the simplicity of anonymity. "Sarah," Derek said, his voice dangerously low, "if you can't respect my training methods, maybe you should look for another gym. There are places more suited to people with your mindset." The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground. "My payment is in, Sensei, and I believe that everyone here deserves a learning environment based on mutual respect, not demeaning." That's when James did something no one expected. He started to smile. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile. It was the slow, calculated smile of a man who had just found a reason to stop hiding. For 20 years, he had carried the guilt of 2 deaths that had indirectly resulted from his involvement in the fighting world. Now, seeing a brave young woman defend the principles of justice he had abandoned decades earlier, James Washington was beginning to remember who he really was. "Derek," James finally said, his voice possessing a calm authority that made everyone in the room turn to look at him. "The young lady is right. This isn't about martial arts. This is about you trying to feel important by humiliating others." Derek spun on his heel, his face flushed with indignation. "How dare you lecture me about martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is." James took a step forward, and something fundamentally changed in his posture. His shoulders straightened, his center of gravity shifted imperceptibly downward, and his feet took a position that any experienced fighter would instantly recognize as ideal. "Actually," James said calmly, "I know exactly what a dojo is, and I know that this place ceased to be one long ago." Derek felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. There was something in the way James moved now, the way he took up space, that awakened every instinct of his for self-preservation, but his wounded pride would not allow him to retreat. "Enough talk," Derek growled, adopting his favorite fighting stance. "I'll teach you respect the hard way." Sarah watched the scene with growing concern, but also with professional interest. She had documented hundreds of hours of sparring and competition for her research, and the movements reminded her of the great masters she had studied in historical videos. The economy of movement, the controlled breathing, the calm presence that exuded pent-up strength. James closed his eyes for a moment and let 22 years of muscle memory wash over him. Every move honed, every battle won, every lesson learned in the world's most brutal rings. When he opened his eyes again, Derek was staring straight into the eyes of Silent Storm Washington, a 5-time mixed martial arts world champion. "One last chance to apologize," James offered good-naturedly. "To her, to her students, and to return this place to its status as a learning space." Derek laughed, but the sound was tense and strained. "Apologize, kid. You'll be begging for forgiveness when you're on the floor." What Derek couldn't see was that James had already identified all of his technical weaknesses. The high guard that left his body exposed. The tendency to retreat right foot first. The ability to telegraph his punches with micro movements of his shoulder. 22 years out of the ring hadn't erased decades of refined technical analysis. Sarah noticed the other students instinctively retreating, like wild animals sensing an approaching storm. The energy in the room had completely changed, as if the air had become electrically charged before lightning struck. It was then, as everyone laughed at Derek's latest taunt, that something unexpected began to form in James's expression. Not anger or a desire for revenge, but the calm determination of a man who had found a reason worth breaking a 20-year vow of silence. Some of those present began to realize that something extraordinary was about to happen, without even fully realizing what their eyes were telling them. Derek adopted his favorite fighting stance, the one he had used to intimidate hundreds of newcomers over the years. Feet shoulder-width apart, fists clenched at chest level, weight slightly forward. The classic stance of a man who had learned martial arts in controlled settings against predictable opponents. James stood motionless for a few seconds, simply watching. His eyes scanned Derek from head to toe, automatically cataloging every technical detail. The high guard that left his ribs exposed. The unsteady base that threw him off balance. The extreme tension in his shoulders that telegraphed every move before it even began. "Still waiting?" Derek said, mockingly, bouncing slightly in place. "Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost?" That's when James did something no one expected. He started moving. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a subtle shift in his feet, a slight drop in his center of gravity, his shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. But to anyone who knew what to look for, the transformation was instantaneous and startling. Sarah Chin felt a chill run down her spine. In 2 years of studying sports biomechanics, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of video footage of great fighters. What she had just witnessed was the transition from an ordinary man to a natural-born predator. A change as subtle as it was devastating. "Interesting," Derek murmured, his confidence wavering for the first time. There was something about the way James now occupied the space that awakened every instinct for self-preservation. James took a step forward, and Derek instinctively retreated. The movement was so involuntary, so primal, that several students noticed it. The black belt retreated before the janitor. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. "Problem?" James asked softly, his voice a quiet authority that drowned out everyone else. Derek felt the blood rush to his cheeks. His reputation was being called into question in front of his own students. He couldn't back down now, even though every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop and apologize. "No problem," Derek said, trying to smile. "Just admiring your posture. Did someone teach you that on YouTube?" The joke fell flat. No one laughed. The tension in the room was almost palpable. "Actually," James said calmly, "I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gym. You may have heard of it." Derek frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place the context. "Las Vegas? Some 3-day camp you went to?" Sarah Chin quietly pulled her phone out of her pocket and quickly typed in Las Vegas National Gym Martial Arts. What she found made her blood run cold. This wasn't just any boot camp. This was the place where some of the greatest MMA champions in the world had trained for the last 3 decades. "Derek," James continued, his voice calm. "Last chance. Apologize to Sarah for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this place into a circus. And most importantly, apologize to yourself for becoming the very person martial arts was meant to teach you not to be." The offer of clemency hung in the air like smoke. Derek could have chosen humility. He could have admitted he had crossed a line. He could have salvaged what little dignity he had left. Instead, he attacked. Derek's first punch was technically perfect. A quick, precise jab, executed exactly as he had learned from a textbook. It was a punch that worked against 99% of the people he had sparred with over the years. James was not in that 99%. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that half the people in the room couldn't even comprehend what had just happened. James simply wasn't where Derek's fist had aimed. His body slid away like water flowing around a rock. And then Derek lost his balance, his arm flying into thin air. "Nice try," James commented softly, already regrouping and perfectly balanced. Clean technique, plenty of speed, but you gave it away with your right shoulder. Derek spun wildly, trying to get a look at his opponent. How could anyone move so fast? Beginner's luck, he muttered, more to himself than to James. The second attack came almost instantly. Jab, straight, hook. 3 punches, all tied together with the precision of a man who had practiced the combination thousands of times. It was his favorite sequence, the one he used to end sparring sessions and impress newbies. Again, James just wasn't there. This time, Sarah managed to follow the movement. James ducked slightly, letting the jab miss his head by inches. The straight punch found air as he leaned back in an impossible arc. And when Derek threw the hook with all his might, James took a small step back, causing the fist to miss his chin by millimeters. Interesting combination, James noted. He was still breathing evenly. Works well against people who are standing still, but you leave your left side completely exposed. Derek began to sweat after the hook. This was not normal. He had thrown thousands of punches in his life, and now he couldn't land a single one on a man who was supposed to have never fought before. "Stop dancing and fighting," Derek yelled, launching into an even more aggressive combination. That's when James decided that the demonstration was enough. Derek's third attack, a desperate combination of punches and kicks, again found only air. But this time, something different happened. As Derek recovered from missing all of his punches, James inexplicably moved closer. "How?" Derek whispered, realizing that he had completely lost control of the distance. "Derek," James said softly, now at arm's length. "You want to know the difference between someone who learned to fight in a gym and someone who learned in a professional ring?" Before Derek could respond, James did something that defied everything anyone in the room knew about physics. Without apparent effort, without any sudden or aggressive movement, he simply touched Derek's chest with the palm of his right hand. Derek went flying. He wasn't pushed or knocked down. He was literally thrown backwards, as if hit by an invisible wave. His feet left the ground. He flew nearly 2 meters through the air and landed on his back with a thud that made everyone in the room gasp. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek lay on the floor for several seconds, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. There was no pain, only the overwhelming strength of a man operating on a level completely different from anything he had ever known. "What?" Derek muttered, trying to stand. "This is impossible." Sarah Chun stopped breathing. In 2 years of studying martial arts, she had never seen such a controlled and destructive display of force. There was no violence. There was no anger, just a clinical application of a technique she had only seen in legends. "Actually," James said calmly, extending a hand to help Derek up. "It's quite simple once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles I've learned over 22 years of professional career." Derek ignored the extended hand and stood up on his own, his legs still shaking. 22 years of professional career in what?" Sarah asked, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't understand who he is, do you?" Everyone turned to look at her, still holding her cell phone with the search results in her hand. On the screen, dozens of articles, photos, and videos confirmed what her instincts already knew. "James Washington," she read aloud, "also known as the Quiet Storm, a 5-time mixed martial arts world champion, widely regarded as one of the best technical fighters in history, retired undefeated after 22 years of fighting, following an accident that resulted in the death of his training partner." The impact of those words hit the room like a bomb. Derek felt his face go pale as the reality began to sink in. He had challenged a living martial arts legend to a fight. He had publicly humiliated someone who could knock him out with one casual move. Five-time world champion, Derek stammered, all his arrogance gone. James nodded silently. "I left when I was 29. Since then, I've worked any job I could find. Cleaning, maintenance, simple work, simple life. No attention, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone." The change in Derek was immediate and painful to watch. The arrogant man was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the extent of his ignorance. I didn't know," Derek whispered. "If I had known..." "If you had known, would you have treated me with respect?" James interrupted gently. But wouldn't you still have humiliated another janitor, another worker who had no credentials to defend himself? The question cut deeper than any physical blow. Derrick knew that James had pinpointed the root of his real problem. Not ignorance of his credentials, but a fundamental arrogance that made him believe he could demean people based on their professions. Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm. Sensei Derrick, I trained at this academy for 2 years out of respect for your expertise. But what I witnessed today was not training. It was bullying disguised as instruction. The other students began to murmur in agreement. The revelation of James's identity had completely changed everyone's perspective on what they had witnessed. James, Derrick finally said, his voice humbling in a way none of them had ever heard before. I sincerely apologize to Sarah, to everyone here. I have no excuse for my behavior. James nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace he'd used to handle the physical confrontation. I appreciate it, Derrick, but an apology is just the first step. The question is, what are you going to do differently from now on? Derrick glanced around the room, taking a fresh look at his students. Some seemed disappointed by his behavior. Others were clearly rethinking everything they thought they knew about respect and hierarchy. I will change, Derrick promised. It will take time, but I will change. That's when Sarah asked the question that surprised everyone. Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again? Because I think we could all learn a lot more from someone who understands that true power comes with responsibility. James smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that night. Maybe, but not to teach martial arts. To teach something far more important. That respect is earned not by belts or titles, but by character. As Derrick absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his life, one question hung in the air. Would one night of humiliation be enough to transform decades of arrogance? Or would it take an even deeper change to achieve true justice? 3 months later, the gym had been completely transformed. James Washington was no longer just a janitor. Sarah Chun had convinced the owner of the gym to hire him as an instructor, specializing in advanced martial arts techniques and philosophy. Derrick Mitchell lost half his students in the first week after the incident. A video Sarah had secretly recorded went viral on social media, showing the black belt being humiliated by a common janitor. His reputation in the martial arts community was in tatters. Sensei James, Sarah said after a lesson on respect and humility. Thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be demonstrated to be recognized. James smiled as he organized his equipment. The best lesson I can teach is simple. Never judge a person by their profession or appearance. Everyone has stories that may surprise us. Derrick continued to teach in the small room, but now with the humility of public shame. He learned the hard way that arrogance has its price. Sometimes justice comes quietly, like a storm that transforms everything without making a sound. James proved that true retribution is not about destroying your opponent, but about demonstrating that greatness comes from character, not titles. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel for more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.